Okay, what we want to cover today is the information in Chapter 12 on production and economic growth. A couple of things we're going to do here. There's not a lot of meat in this chapter per se, but it deals with a concept of externalities, which we've talked about before earlier in the course. As part of that issue of externalities, I want to explore what a lot of people think was an externality that was the basis or the cause, not really the cause, but kind of the basis or the thinking that went into creation of two government entities called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which in turn may have been the real root cause of the Great Recession that started in 2008. So let's go through. First, we'll take the part that's in the chapter 12, and then we'll launch into the root causes of the Great Recession. So first, let's look at what it takes to promote growth in a country. In order for any country to grow, it has to have certain institutional structures that make growth and prosperity possible. The first, of course, is strong property rights and political stability. We've seen here that even in terms of property rights, you can own anything, you can buy things, and we have a government that is politically stable. We have representative government, and as a result, our contracts that we negotiate are enforced under the rule of law. So, property rights, political stability, the rule of law are key to the functioning of a government. Secondly, patents and copyrights. We have to be able to protect patents and copyrights. And that's exactly what they do. We have to be able to protect innovative concepts like, as in the case of a patent or a new invention. And we have to be able to protect intellectual rights like music, movies, videos, etc. Thirdly, efficient financial institutions, which we have. New York City is key to exchanges of information and financial information and financial transactions between every and many countries of the world. The same exists also in San Francisco. Next, literacy and widespread education. One of the things that we focus on now in assisting these less developed countries is to make sure we set up a system where they can educate their population. One of the keys to political stability is an educated electorate, which means the people who vote know exactly what they're voting for and completely understand what they're voting for. Of course, you have to have the freedom to vote at the same time. Next, as we talked earlier, free trade. Free trade based on comparative advantage one country may have over the other countries in the world. So free trade is key to growth and production in any country. Health and nutrition. We want to have a healthy and population, and that requires that we manage our lives in such a way that we eat nutritional food and we understand and know what nutritional food is. That, of course, harkens back to widespread education. Research and development. How do we go forward beyond where we are today? The key is research and development. Research and development is required and necessary, for instance, as we saw in earlier chapters, to move that production possibilities curve through technology. Well, technology only comes with research and development. And lastly, a competitive market system. Competitive market system where you have the choice as to what you buy and you have the income to buy it. So a competitive market system where the buyers and sellers come together in the marketplace and agree on price, quantity, demand, and supply. The four things in any market, price, quantity, demand, and supply, are the keys to a competitive market system. Productivity. One of the important elements of growth in an economy, increasing gross domestic product, is the productivity of the working population. So what it means is the quantity of goods and services produced by each unit of labor input. Now, that's a fancy term for saying that we, as a working force in an economy are able to produce more and more things with the influence and the increase in technology, not only technology, but also machinery, better machinery, which probably comes through invention, so that we are able to produce more goods per unit of output, which is more goods per hour, or more goods per shift, more goods per week, more goods per year. That increases the productivity of the country with about the same labor input. So increasing productivity, as we said, means growth. Again, back to the production possibilities curve. To move that curve requires technology. Technology results in increases in productivity. So the two go hand in hand. If you want to increase productivity, invest in technology. For many companies, if they don't realize what's going on, they don't invest in technology, they don't improve their productivity, they will eventually fade away. Now, economy to grow GDP, living standards must improve, population productivity must be increasing. So along with all of this increase in productivity, we get to see the growth of the economy, and as a result of the growth of the economy, the living standards of the population improve. Better education, better health systems, etc. So, progress more towards goods and services produced by fewer people. That's what we're talking about. More and more product produced with less and less hours of work and fewer people. Now, in many cases, that results in unemployment in certain sectors. For instance, changing production of automobiles from people to robots. Okay, this results in a reduction in the number of people hired to work in the automobile industry. It's a fact of life. However, if you think about the robots, somebody has to be trained to maintain those robots. So where you may have a reduction in employment in a certain area, it may result in additional employment in another area. Also key to what happens in this process is that in the process of progress is that people need a retraining program. They need to be retrained from doing what they were doing for years and years to improving their knowledge base and finding jobs in other areas. Capital required. Now, there are several things that are required to be successful and to grow an economy. One of them, of course, is capital. We've talked about that earlier. Physical capital, the tools and equipment to make things. Workers produce goods and services, and they need equipment in the factory to produce those goods, and they need the factory in the first place to produce those goods. So requirement in physical capital, when we talk about physical capital, we mean plant and equipment to produce goods and services that workers use to produce what they're selling, what the company is selling. We need human capital, a knowledgeable and skilled workforce implying a high level of education and training. This is also key, and it goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier that's key to growth of an economy. We need an electorate that's well educated and trained. One of the things that happens, for instance, companies hate to lay people off. And the reason they do is they've made an investment in human capital. Their workforce is skilled, it's been trained. To let someone go because of a slowdown in the economy is very painful for companies because it's a reduction in human capital. Reduce the human capital, the physical capital is underutilized. Natural resources are important. We need to be able to produce goods, and then we have to be able to get them to market. We need navigable rivers, we need oceans, we need boats to get all this stuff out to the people who will be buying it and the people who will be selling it. So a lot of these resources are provided by nature, of course, minerals. For instance, gold, we use gold contacts on printed circuit boards in the computer business. Technical knowledge, understanding the best ways to produce the goods at the lowest possible cost. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The company with the lowest cost is the company that wins. And that's key to success. So, because you need to be the lowest cost producer, you need to adopt technology, technical knowledge, and not be afraid of it. Very, very often, people who don't understand technological things shy away from them. And it damages a company. If you don't adopt technology as a company, you are doomed to failure. Okay, public versus private goods. We've talked about this before, so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. A private good has two things part of it. It has rivalry and excludability. So let's talk about that. Rivalry means that I am competing with someone else or many other people for the private good that I want to buy and consume. And once I do that and buy it and consume it, and it's in my possession, I then can consume it and no one else can have it. So I am competing with other people for my chocolate chip cookies. Once I buy it, once I consume it, no one else gets it. Secondly, we have excludability, which means that once I've gotten it, I consume it, it's excluded from anyone else. I'm the only person who has it. Those are private goods. Let's look at the public side. Public side has no rivalry and no excludability. For instance, a good consumed by one person doesn't mean another person is precluded from consuming the same good. Think about food stamps. In the case of food stamps, it doesn't matter if I go and get food stamps because I haven't taken them away from someone else. All we need to do in order to get food stamps is to be qualified. Okay. So I'm not competing with you in terms of income to buy it one another. You are qualified, I'm qualified, we get it. We're going to get the product. Doesn't matter. Non-excludability, again, if I get food stamps, I have not in any way, shape, or form excluded anyone else from getting those food stamps. The criteria, of course, that the government has to use is, are you qualified for the program? So let's look at public goods closer. Public goods and quasi-public goods are the goods and services the government provides us with. Okay? So when we talk about a public good, we mean a good provided by federal, state, or local government. We also talk about and introduce a term here called quasi-public goods. Those are public goods that are available to everyone through the government. For instance, traffic lights, double yellow line down a two-lane highway. They're government-served goods and services provided by the government, and they're quasi-public goods. So users of public goods may or may not be the one who pay for those goods. For instance, in the case of food stamps. Food stamps are there for the less fortunate. It provides them with the ability to buy food that they need to support their families when they're going through a tough time, out of a job, etc. So food stamps are part of the public goods system, again, and they're used to subsidize people who are temporarily out of work and in need of additional funds so they can feed their families. So regulations are developed to influence the use and demand for goods and services. We all know what this is. We introduce regulations, we introduce laws, we influence the use of demand for goods and services. You have to qualify for food stamps. In the case of a quasi-public good like a traffic light, you stop on red, you go on green, and you hit the accelerator and try to get through the light as fast as you can on yellow. How efficient is government in determining what goods and services to provide? You know, it's a tough thing for them. Again, we talked about the government before in terms of they don't have the ability to look at goods and services with the invisible hand, which is the interaction of buyers and sellers, supply, demand, price, quantity. So they're missing the key tool. So what they try to do is make sure they determine what the needs are and make sure that they don't have unintended consequences. I give you, for instance, in the George W. Bush administration, they put together a law that said there's a lot of endangered people in the world, and if you're endangered, you have the right to apply for the United States as not necessarily having to have to meet the import quotas, but as a victim of abuse or whatever in a foreign country, you can come here under the guise of political asylum. So you don't have to meet quotas. You don't have to be in, go through the vetting processes that we go through to bring people into this country. Now, that's a great thing. Good idea. Help people. Make sure that they don't get damaged or hurt in a situation which is maybe government organized revolution, etc. But there are unintended consequences. As a result of this program, some people in Latin America abused it. As a matter of fact, in 1 month, some 60,000 people, mainly women and children, migrated into the United States under this program. Difficult for us to absorb 60,000 people coming into the country, but the concept was used to break down, breach the immigration laws and requirements for the United States. And that was the unintended consequences of that law. Okay, let's talk about externalities of public goods. Positive externalities for public goods, we all know what those are. Use the example here of having to have to get a valid driver's license in order to drive a car so that we don't have accidents on the road and kill people. We have to pass a test, and we have to have liability insurance. Okay, so those are positive externalities. They're used to protect the innocent bystander, okay, from illegal or improper actions. Negative externalities involve CO2, emitting plants, coal-fired plants producing electricity that emit CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, part of the reason and part of the attempts to control this is what's called cap and trade. This program is pretty prevalent in California, for instance, and we'll talk about some of the elements of cap and trade and how it works. So, a negative externality is allowing CO2 emissions from coal-fired plants, utility plants. And one of the keys to this, of course, is that if, for instance, in the case of this, firms have to buy credits and or they have to put huge scrubbers on the stacks that emit CO2, it would require them probably to seek a better rate of sales of electricity. So the bottom line is that if you take care of this problem, you may end up paying a higher cost for your electricity. Population growth. As workers die off and retire the workforce, some economists believe the birth rate must keep pace in this reduction of the labor force. This is an important element today because what we have is that the birth rate in the United States has dropped dramatically. It's less than 2 children per family, per couple. People are waiting longer to get married, having fewer children because they're waiting longer. And so what's happened is the birth rate has fallen behind the retirement rate for older people. So the labor force is important because the labor force is needed to maintain a higher standard of living. So it's an issue that we've got to be careful of. Now, some believe otherwise. Thomas Malthus advanced the population growth. Thomas Malthus was writing back in the time when we're pretty much an agrarian economy, agriculture. He didn't foresee the improvements that would be made with the use of tractors, combines, methods of planting, methods of maintaining the soil, fertilizer. Okay. So what he said was going to happen is that the population growth would grow too fast. It would outstrip the amount of food we could produce. And as a result, a lot of people would starve to death. But as I said, he failed to take into consideration the fact that technology would play an important part. And we are now producing more food and more food to feed the population size that we have. It's not a problem, at least not in this country. Now, let's talk about an externality that was created by the government, and it's called the dream of home ownership. And it led government to do certain things that maybe were not the smartest and the best things to do. And the concept of the dream of home ownership got out of control. The idea behind it is that it's key to the American dream that everybody own their own home. I'm not convinced that that's true. Um, for instance, when you're first starting out, you need to rent probably to decide where you're going to be permanently. Let's say you've moved from one city or one state to another to take a job. Do you really want to buy a home until you see how you're going to like that area? Uh, Old retired people, is it smart for them to stay in their homes? Maybe not. It may be smarter for people to rent at a time when they're in the later stages. You see springing up, particularly around here, a lot of retirement homes. Okay, so let's talk about this dream and how it got us into trouble. Came out of the Great Depression, and it was called the American Dream. It was coined during the Roosevelt administration when things were rotten. We're trying to get things going and get the economy back on track. Supported again later in 1994 by Bill Clinton. And Clinton said more Americans should own their own homes for reasons that are economic and tangible, and reasons that are emotional and intangible, but go to the heart of what it means to harbor, to nourish, to expand the American dream. He's talking here mostly about people getting into their homes, getting into homes and owning a home, and unfortunately not really considering whether they can afford it. And I'm going to show you what happens. So home ownership stood at 64%, but by 2000, it would be 70%. When we started to come out of the recession, it had dropped back to 62%. I think it's about 63.5% now. So it's improved a little bit better. But you see what happened. As a result of this whole process and this whole program, home ownership actually increased to 70%. But when the bottom fell out and the housing bubble burst as a result of too much money in circulation in terms of mortgages, that we ended up taking 2 steps back. So the government decided that what we needed to do was to support the banking system so that the banks could lend money for mortgages, and mortgages at the time were 30 years in duration with 20% down. So what they said was 1938, let's create the National Mortgage Association, called Fannie Mae, during the Great Depression. Their job was to buy loans from banks, pull them together in what's called a tranche or a derivative, and sell them off to investors. Now, this was set up as a government-sponsored enterprise, and they were supposed to buy FHA mortgages and mortgage-backed securities. So they would buy the mortgages, put them together in packages called a tranche or a derivative, and sell them off to investors. In 1954, they converted it to a corporation, the government did. Common stock was sold to the public, preferred stock was held by the federal government. In 1968, it was converted completely to a publicly held corporation. The idea behind this was the government wanted to get out of the business of being the one to guarantee these mortgages. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac were guaranteeing the mortgages they were providing to people, and they were writing insurance against it. And the people that were on the hook were the federal government. What the federal government wanted was to get out from under that. So it wasn't on their budget, and it wasn't part of the government liabilities. However, reality is the perception in the minds of government officials, the industry, and investors was that any investments sold by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be guaranteed against financial loss, even though it was written nowhere. The perception in the minds of people was that we don't have to worry about this investment because it's insured. It's guaranteed by the federal government. Fannie Mae and the tranches. Excuse me. in the name of home ownership for Americans. What Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did, we're talking mostly about Fannie Mae because whatever Fannie Mae did, Freddie Mac did as well. And we'll talk about Freddie Mac in a minute. So what these guys do, they package loans into tranches or derivatives. We usually refer to them as derivatives because they derive their value from what's underneath them, the mortgages. We resold them, Fannie Mae resold them to Wall Street or other investors, and Wall Street in turn sold them to investors as well. So it's a great concept. What it did, what it allowed people to do was to take money from the banks. The banks got their money back so they could lend them out in other places. So the tranche gives the lender back his money and enables him to relend that money on another mortgage to assist people to fulfill the American dream of home ownership. System worked until the world of tranches was opened up to subprime mortgages. Now, understand at this time that the rating agencies, because the mortgages were 20% down, 30 years, that the rating agencies said to themselves, these are good investments, we'll stamp them AAA because people will walk away from their automobiles, their credit cards, anything else. They will not walk away from their homes. So what's a subprime mortgage? Basically, it's anything that is not a 30-year or a fixed-year mortgage with 20% down. That's probably the simplest definition for it. Anything that's different from that is a subprime mortgage. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a 30-year or a 15-year mortgage with 25% down, 30% down, 50% down. They're all good, okay? This is the standard or the minimum. But a subprime mortgage can be anywhere from 1 to 5 to 7 years in duration, rather than 30 years or 15 years. It may also have a low teaser interest rate. Okay, one of the things that was happening in the 70s, in the 90s and into the 2000s is that people were giving out mortgages using teaser rates. Now, what that meant was they would give you a mortgage at a 1% interest. That 1% interest meant that you could qualify at a lower price for the mortgage because it was only 1% interest. And what they did was the 1% interest only lasted for 2 years or 1 year even. And then the difference between the going rate in the mortgage, which let's say the mortgage rate at the time was 5%, yet they only charged 1%. So there's 4% interest missing somewhere. So what would happen, and it was in the fine print of the mortgage, is that they would add that 4% to the back end of the principal of the mortgage. So sooner or later, you're going to pay it. Okay? The other thing they did was zero down or little down, 5% down, 10% down, 15% down, or nothing down. Okay? Low down payments. So you didn't have any, or what do you say, any skin in the game. And also stated income. If you said you made $100,000 a year, they just took it. Okay, you don't have to prove it. We don't need to see your tax returns. We don't need to see your W-2 statement from your company. So these are subprime mortgages, and they are less than favorable. Subprime loans. So to finance a subprime loan, when it comes due, you have to pay it back. So let's say you took out, in case of a mortgage, you got a second mortgage on your home for $50,000 for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you had to pay all the $50,000 back. Even though you were paying interest as you're going along, this is an interest-only loan, you had to pay the $50,000 back or refinance it with someone else. So it's a great thing when you take it out because you got the cash. It becomes a problem when you have to pay it back. The duration is too short. So another feature of these subprime loans is because they were higher risk to the people putting up the money, the lender, they carried with them a higher rate of interest and probably in many cases less favorable terms. But the key was a higher rate of interest. So There's no single definition about what a subprime loan is, but in many cases, we talked about FICO scores in the beginning of the class, and we talked about a 700, 740 being excellent, being where you want to be. But in many cases during this time period, loans were made to people who had a FICO score of 640 or below, and that is not good. So Fannie Mae, not worried, they have a big partner. In other words, everybody believed that even though this was a private corporation, Uncle Sam would take care of us. If we invested in these tranches, no big problem because they were insured and Uncle Sam would take care of us. Interestingly enough, when it all fell apart, Uncle Sam put up $151 billion to bail out the bad mortgages Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had on their balance sheet. So the whole problem, the whole cost of this program, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, was to cost the American taxpayer $151 billion. So affordable housing came along in the late 90s, in the 90s, and in the 2000s. And they have an impact on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So what's happening is that politicians are pushing more and more people to get into homes and to make homes more and more affordable. So in 1970, they said, Fannie Mae, you can purchase private mortgages now, not just government mortgages, FHA or VAs. They spin off Ginnie Mae to do the FHA and VA insured loans, and they create a company called Freddie Mac to compete with Fannie Mae. There's no reason why Freddie Mac should be around. It just competes with Fannie Mae. And it's kind of a phony thing because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't really need to compete with one another. They both do the same thing. Okay, 1992, President Bush, this is the first President Bush, signs the Housing Community Development Act, charters the GSEs, again, GSEs are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to finance affordable housing for low and moderate income families. So here we go. We're trying to push the American dream down into low and moderate income families. The GSAs now are required to meet affordable housing goals. Initially, 30% of all loans they brought in had to be for affordable housing. In 2007, this was raised as high as 55%. So, 1999, the Clinton administration takes it one step further and says that in addition to this, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you have to include designated distressed inner city areas. Okay? So we're teeing up Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy risky loans. Federal Housing Enterprise and Safety Soundness Act 1992, this is the one that President Bush signed. It was initially there to be to protect against financial losses in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Actually, it had an opposite effect because attached to the law was a requirement that they had to finance the 30% low and moderate income families and 30% to housing located in inner cities, which I just discussed. House Banking Committee used ACORN to develop these goals. ACORN was a community area organizer, very powerful at one point in time, had over 400,000 members, and it was in most of the major cities in the U.S. And its goals were to increase employment for minorities, get them into homes, etc. So what they did was, as a result of this law, they said, let's take a look at the underwriting standards and see what we can change to make it easier for people of low and moderate income families to buy homes. So the first thing they did was let's forget the 20% down payment. Let's not require 20% down. Let's drop that underwriting standard. Underwriting, by the way, is when the bank takes a look at your ability to borrow the money and decides whether they're going to make you the loan or not. They look at your income, they look at your W-2, They look at your financial worth, your balance sheet. They look at also your tax returns for the last 2 years. So now, 1991 to 1998, a man named James Johnson takes over Fannie Mae. Now, up until this time, when Johnson takes over as CEO of Fannie Mae's bonus system to its executives was that they were tasked to bring in high quality loans into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Johnson takes over, and this is what he looks like. This is the good looking dude. He's now in charge of Fannie Mae in 1991. He becomes CEO. He changes Fannie Mae. Executive pay performance now goes from the metrics that I just mentioned, which were performance to get good quality loans into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to make it earnings per share goals. So if you could improve the earnings per share, you got big bonuses. 1992 to 2000, executive pay at Fannie Mae increased from $8.5 million to $35.2 million. He rode the Affordable Housing Initiative, pledging $10 billion for lower income borrowers. So he sees the need to get on the bandwagon to improve housing for lower and middle income borrowers. He silences critics by partnering up with ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform. Now, ACORN is no longer in business. It was subsidized to some extent by the government, but unfortunately, the board of directors and the key members of ACORN were stealing from the company. So discrimination was a threat. He was afraid, Johnson was afraid that if they didn't get on this bandwagon to give loans to lower income people, that they would be charged or accused of discrimination in lending. So he decides flexible underwriting for minority and low income areas. He announced a program called Fannie Neighbors. Flexible underwriting was the code word when standard income, assets, or ability to pay criteria were not met. So he says, all right, we're going to do Fannie Neighbors, and we're going to have flexible underwriting for minority and low-income areas. Cries of racial discrimination result in abandonment of risk-averse practices. So, takes care of the problem. 1994 to 1997, he boasts that he spent $7 billion on underwriting experiments to prevent this criticism. Underwriting experiments include lack of credit history, not a negative factor in granting a loan. High expense ratios for low-income borrowers should not disqualify them. Cash on hand should be counted as a means of payment. That's an interesting one because cash on hand, if you use that as a basis for making future payments, what can happen to you is that the borrower will get the money, and any cash on hand he has, he'll go out and spend it on a new car or whatever. So there's a risk there. So why worry? Even though they were engaging in these liberal policies for lending money, everyone knew that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would not default, that the government would bail them out. The government being taxpayers, us. So how did they manage to pull this off? Well, they controlled the politicians. 1996, Fannie gives $200,000 to political parties, and its employees contribute another $113,000 to political parties. Fannie Mae has 36 registered lobbyists on the payroll. Now, think of this. Here is a government-sponsored entity. And because they are a government-sponsored entity, you wonder, why the hell do they need 36 registered lobbyists? Well, they needed it to keep the politicians under control. Go around Congress, spend money, buy lunches, trips, tickets to ball games, etc. Keep them working. September 1996, he writes a book showing America a New Way Home, expanding opportunities for home ownership. Again, throw away the solid criteria for new loans, underwriting standards. Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, says this is a wonderful book, and it is a roadmap toward making the dream of home ownership come true for Americans. Again, here we are being quoted again, the externality called the American dream, which is to own your own home. The theme permeates through this whole era. So Johnson creates the Fannie Mae Foundation. He takes $350 million of Fannie Mae stock, puts it in the foundation. The stock, because they're doing so well from an earnings per share standpoint, the stock grows, and they're able to give out $20 million a year. So they spend $38.6 million for advertising, boosting Fannie's earnings. Johnson hands out $2.5 million in checks to Washington, D.C. based on neighborhood groups from the Senate caucus room. Now, who gets the money? The Black Caucus and the Hispanic and Black Caucus as well. These caucuses were given the money because these guys pretty much represented the inner city people and the lower income folks in districts around the country. So Johnson knew where his bread was buttered. He needed to keep these people in his sphere of influence. He had a key benefactor in Congress, Barney Frank. He was an ardent supporter of Fannie Mae. He was asked some questions in 2005 by a reporter who, by the way, smelled something was wrong. And he asked Barney, he said, what is the downside of this home ownership drive? And Barney, are you worried about your constituents being dragged into homes they can't afford? And what about these complaints we're getting about homeowners being trapped in properties and facing financial ruin? Barney's response at the time, we'll deal with that problem if it happens. Now, this is March of 2005. By September of 2008, the bottom falls out of the housing market completely. Congressional hearings. Barney Frank, he got a donation from Fannie Mae for $40,000 in campaign contributions. His boyfriend was an executive at Fannie Mae. And when things go sour, you can always blame Bush. Here's how they did it. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac gave campaign contributions between 1989 and 2008 to the following people. Chris Dodd, who was forced to resign. Dodd didn't resign. He just didn't go for re-election. He got in trouble because they found out he got a loan from Countrywide Home Loan, which we'll talk about in a minute. So Chris Dodd, John Kerry, Secretary of State, also ran for president. He got $111,000. President Obama got $105,000. Hillary Clinton ran for president last year, got $75,000. And so on down the line, you'll see our friend Barney Frank over there at $40,000. Who else? Nancy Pelosi got $32,000. She is the Republican key person in the Congress. So what they did was they made sure they made political contributions to the people that would keep the regulators away from looking at the books for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it worked, kept them at bay. Then we had passed the Home Disclosure Act in 1975. It was amended in 1991. And it revolved around disclosure of borrowers and mortgage applications. But based on Acorn, I'm going to skip through this. This was Disclosure Act. This was made to push people into more mortgages. The Boston Fed in 1992 made a study and found that the rejection ratio for minorities in Boston was 2.8 times higher than it was for non-minority borrowers. The problem is that no one took the trouble to look at the qualifications of the borrowers to meet lender guidelines. Again, this is 1992. It's early in the process, and we have not yet gotten to the point where we're going to do all these neat, creative financing things. Andrew Cuomo, currently governor of the state of New York, wants to run for president, I believe, in 2020. Cuomo, head of HUD in Washington, D.C., Housing and Urban Development Program. He says GSE's presence, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, in the subprime market can be a significant benefit to lower income families. So, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you are now going to take subprime mortgages. 1999, they bought 42% of the mortgage loans to low and moderate income families. Cuomo pushes that to 50%, forcing the GSEs to buy even riskier mortgages. 1999, 160 billion of subprime loans were bought compared to 40 billion 5 years earlier. So they're going into subprime mortgages in a big way, and they're being forced in due to legislation and government pressure. In 2008, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's toxic mortgages would amount to $1.6 trillion. Now, when I say a toxic mortgage, I mean a mortgage that is behind in payments. Tentative could be in foreclosure. During this time period and subsequently, our foreclosure rate for homes in the United States reached 5 million homes. That's a lot. That's people walking away from their homes, 5 billion families. Freddie Mac. Skip through this quickly. They're doing much of the same thing. I'm not too concerned about that. Okay, Fannie and Freddie go to Congress. Congress hauls them in and says, "What's going on?" Cartoon says, "Truth is, Congressman, we didn't know it was wrong to screw people." Well, not really. These guys were being forced to take these mortgages based on not only because people who were running Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got greedy, not only because there were people in Congress who were helping them along the way, but also, they were forced into it by legislation. Let's not forget that. Okay, guess what? Other companies started to look at this thing and say, "Whoa, these guys will make a lot of money. This is a good deal." So private companies start to move into the subprime world because now they can sell it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They couldn't before. So Angelo Mozillo, he's the CEO of Countrywide Financial. He states that we've got to get on this program. We need to eliminate down payments for low-income consumers, and we need to reduce loan processing so that loans can be approved in minutes. Now, Countrywide Financial is a huge lender, headquartered in Calabasas, California, huge headquarters. And up until this time, and until the time Angelo Mozillo comes along, they wouldn't touch a subprime mortgage. Now they're into it full boat. Johnson likes Angelo. So he says, "You know what, Angelo? I'm going to buy all your stuff. And I'm going to charge you a lower fee than I am your rivals." By the way, that's against the law. So Countrywide becomes the largest seller of loans to Fannie Mae. And guess what? Countrywide develops a loan processing software called Fast and Easy. Remember that, Fast and Easy. Because Fast and Easy meant no required income, no asset documentation, a debt-to-equity ratio of 50%. Okay? Debt-to-equity ratios were somewhere between 25 and 35%. They bumped it up to 50%. That meant that you could have a loan if you had at least 50% of your income, you could cover the payment. That's too high. Doesn't leave money for anything else. Fannie Mae and Countrywide, Fast and Easy. I'm going to go through this quickly, but here's the essence of Fast and Easy. You have two jobs, freshman at Baja Fresh and 7-Eleven at night. The computer would automatically classify that person as a manager and assign an income level of 100,000, and the loan would go through. Fannie Mae begins a customer engagement program to reach out to key executives of Countrywide. They love these guys. In 2005, Countrywide sells $12.7 billion of subprime loans to Fannie Mae. 2/3 of them are 100% loan to value. If you're a homeowner and you have a mortgage that's 100% of the value of your home, you are a renter with a mortgage. Not good. Every one of those $12.7 billion in loans would become toxic meaning they're not going to get paid off. They're not going to get paid back. People can't make the monthly payments. They're going to go into foreclosure and default. Angelo, here he is appearing before Congress. He got caught manipulating his stock. That's what he looked like. Angelo. He was voted by Condé Nast Magazine the second worst American CEO of all time. CNN, 10 most wanted culprits in the 2008 crisis. Co-founder of IndyMac. His income from 2001 to 2006 was approximately $470 million. He had friends in good places. He gave special mortgages to Jim Johnson. Okay, that's our guy at Fannie Mae. Franklin Maines, also at Fannie Mae. Chris Dodd in Congress. Ken Conrad in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi's son, Barbara Boxer in the Senate, and 40 executives at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So he knew how to play the game. He learned from Johnson at Fannie Mae how to play the game and how to keep these guys in your pocket. 2010, he got in trouble with the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission. He was charged with fines of $67.5 million for securities fraud and insider trading. $67.5 million to Angelo was a drop in the bucket, considering he made $470 million before that. Very, very limited problem. Fine penalty. As a side note, last year, because people were screaming that nobody went to jail for this whole crisis, the Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, brought charges against Angelo. And in looking at it, they examined it. They were going to prosecute him. All of a sudden, it was dropped. And why was it dropped? It was dropped because Angelo knew too much. So they could not bring him to trial. They could not charge him with anything because they were afraid of what he would say and what disclosures would come out of it. So nobody was ever prosecuted. Angelo came close. Political progress by Angelo. He saw what Johnson and Raines accomplished, took a page out of their book. So in 1998, he made political contributions of $60,000. But by 2003, his political contributions went to $1.1 million. In 2005, 3 years before the bottom fell out, he gave $1.52 million to political parties. Money was spent to help stop new lending laws at the Treasury, Federal Reserve, House, and Senate. He added key members to his board. One was a former director of HUD, and the other was a former head of the San Francisco Bank for the Federal Reserve. He knew how to play the game. The lending practices: no income, no documentation. The debt-to-equity ratio of borrowers could not be verified because of a lack of documentation. Didn't worry about that. The Wall Street Journal reported Representative Howard McEwen, Republican, California. Again, Countrywide was located in California. Per Angelo, get them a loan, take 1 point off, no garbage fees, approve the loan, and make it no documentation. Howard McEwen essentially got a loan with no qualifying. Countrywide would lend up to 95% of a property's value. Maxine Waters, congressman from California, said that this is wonderful. We have the American Dream Down Payment Initiative. Again, you'll see that concept, the externality, American Dream. Her down payment initiative was if you were a renter, you didn't have to put any money down to get a mortgage. So within 2 years, Countrywide would be writing no money down loans with abandon. Home equity extraction. Now, here we go. The idea of bringing people with low and income levels and inner city people into the housing American dream of owning your home ownership was starting to lose some speed. So what they came up with was a home equity extraction mortgage, which was going to be used to apply to people who had equity in their homes and could afford to make the monthly payments. And again, these are short-term loans. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve, should have had his eyes open to this stuff. Said the surge in cash-out mortgage refinancing likely improved rather than worsen the financial condition of the average American homeowner. So if you had a $300,000 mortgage, your property, or the house is worth $300,000. You had a mortgage of $200,000. Your property improved in value to $400,000 as a result of this boom. The banks would lend you $100,000 in cash. You could take that cash and go spend it. And people did. They spent it on everything but what they should have spent it on. Okay. So in 2005, borrowers extracted $750 billion from their homes. The problem is they didn't use the money wisely. 2/3 of it went on personal consumption, nice cars, home improvements, credit card debt. In many cases, people went out and bought a second home. And when the crash comes, they're going to get hit double. So the Fed issues a report and says that everything's fine. Historical trends, no, there's no problem. Problem is, the way they did the study was incorrect. They included people who had no mortgage debt at all in their base, and that skewed their numbers. Okay? So the study wasn't correct. So be careful what these guys put out. Subprime mortgage options. A little bit of a joke. As an alternative to traditional 30-year mortgage, we also offer an interest-only mortgage, balloon mortgage, reverse mortgage, upside-down mortgage, inside-out mortgage, loop-de-loop mortgage, and the spinning double axle mortgage with a triple LUTs. Alternate A loans are the loans we're talking about now. We're no longer talking about helping people get into homes with low and moderate income. We're now talking about people who are qualified for their homes, and we're going to give them short-term loans, seconds, for 5 years, okay, at interest rates, so they can take the money out of their homes. 2001, 2006, metropolitan area rise, prices go up 10%. Big boom. End of 2004, well, Raines lost his job. He was cheating. Washington begins to worry that the GSEs are too highly leveraged. They are maintaining profitability by holding mortgages, hedging the risk with derivatives. So what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were doing, where they were holding on to mortgages, getting the income from it, and where the mortgages were probably questionable, a little bit more questionable, they were hedging them with derivatives, selling them off. Alternating loans, short-term loans to individuals that qualify but are refinancing to monetize the equity of their homes. In other words, the alternate A loans were used to take cash out of your home. Great. If the price of the home keeps going up, no problem. The value of the homes. GSA is an alternate A, 1 in 5 mortgages. By the end of 2000, Fannie Mae had a $350 billion exposure in alternate A loans and another $166 billion in subprime loans. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, same thing, $205 billion in alternate A, $173 billion in subprime. This is a big, big risk to these guys. Okay? Balance sheet debt to equity ratio was 60-1. Affordable housing, the original criteria to get all this stuff going, and subprime loans had drifted into the background as profit and bonus objectives took over. So it all became an issue of money. Money for the subprime lenders like Countrywide, and money for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I hope you can see this. This is the subprime 25, and this is how much they lent out. These are the 25 top subprime lenders. You can see the biggest is Countrywide, and they're almost at 100 million. I'm sorry, 100 billion. In total, these guys lent out $1.4 trillion. In total, all the subprime lenders, 1.4 trillion. And these guys, the 25 by themselves, did most of it for almost $1 trillion. And you look at the list, Countrywide, of course, is the biggest, but you look at the list and look carefully at it because all 25 disappeared through bankruptcy or acquisition. Bubble burst. This is an index. Housing prices climb, climb, climb. You can see in 2006, 2007, they peak and start to come down. If you draw a regression line from where it should be to where it is now, or where it started at, you'll see that we're back to where we should have been in the first place without this bubble. It's a vicious cycle. This is what happened, and it's hard to break. Your housing prices decline. You've now got a mortgage that's worth more than what your house is worth. Your mortgage is higher than the value of your house. Your third box down, you have a choice. Either walk away or foreclose, or hang on and make the mortgage payments. The problem is most people had to walk away. So mortgage payments decline, values decline, the banks incurred losses, the banks stop lending, okay, and the cycle continues. And as the banks stop lending, prices of homes continue to decline, and they won't lend against homes that are declining in value. So it's a vicious cycle and very, very difficult to break. Okay, that's it for now. And I'll see you next Tuesday. We'll have a quiz on Tuesday and move on to the next chapter, chapter 13.